The story you're about to hear is one of betrayal, heartbreak, and the struggle to rebuild after unimaginable pain. My father-in-law bent me over and did this begins with a moment of weakness and unfolds into a web of secrets that threaten to destroy a marriage. How far would you go to save what you thought was unbreakable? And what happens when the ones you love the most are the ones who hurt you the deepest? Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe for more captivating stories and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. When my father-in-law moved in with us, I never imagined how drastically my life would change. It started innocently enough, just helping him adjust to the rhythms of our household. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. A line was crossed. The day my husband Aaron came home with his father's bags in tow, I was busy folding laundry in the living room. My marriage to Aaron had been teetering on the edge of monotony for months. He worked long hours at the firm, and our conversations often felt more like updates than meaningful exchanges. I loved him. I still do. But something intangible between us had faded. When Tom stepped through the door, his presence filled the room. My father-in-law had always been larger than life. At 58, he carried himself with a confidence that belied his years. Silver streaked his dark hair, and his deep-set eyes held a charm that could disarm anyone. He greeted me warmly, enveloping me in one of his bear hugs. "It's so good to see you, Melissa," he said, his voice rich and resonant. "Thanks for letting me crash here for a while. I promise I won't be a bother." "It's no trouble at all," I replied, smiling as I pulled away, catching a whiff of his cologne, cedarwood, smoky and intoxicating. Tom had been through a tough year. After losing his wife, Aaron's mother, to a sudden illness, he sold the family home and decided to simplify his life. Aaron suggested he stay with us while figuring out his next steps. I thought it was a great idea, at least initially. In the following days, Tom settled in seamlessly. He was a natural at making himself useful around the house, fixing leaky faucets, taking out the trash before I even noticed it needed doing, and offering to help with meals. It was a stark contrast to Aaron, who was either at work or glued to his phone, fielding client calls even during dinner. "You've got quite the helper there," I joked to Aaron one evening as Tom insisted on doing the dishes after dinner. Aaron barely looked up from his email. "Yeah, Dad's always been good at that kind of stuff. You don't have to let him do everything, though." "Not letting him." "He wants to," I replied, but Aaron had already moved on to another email. Tom, on the other hand, noticed everything. "Melissa, you've got a knack for cooking," he said one night while we sat in the kitchen. Aaron had a late meeting and it was just the two of us. "Thanks," I replied, feeling a blush creep up my neck. "I just follow recipes." He smiled, his eyes lingering on me in a way that felt both flattering and unnerving. "You make it look effortless. Aaron's lucky to have you." The compliment hung in the air, heavy with meaning I wasn't ready to explore. As the weeks passed, I began to notice how Tom had a way of making me feel seen in ways Aaron no longer did. When I mentioned a book I was reading, Tom would ask questions, genuinely interested in my thoughts. If I came downstairs looking frazzled, he'd offer to make me coffee, insisting I take a break. One rainy afternoon, I found myself standing at the window, staring out at the gray drizzle. Aaron was out of town for a client meeting, and Tom was working in the garage fixing a broken shelf. I wandered in to check on him, partly out of boredom and partly because I found his company oddly comforting. "Need a hand?" I asked, leaning against the doorway. He looked up from the shelf, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "I'm not sure you're dressed for the job," he teased, nodding at my leggings and oversized sweater. "Fair point," I said, laughing. He wiped his hands on a rag and gestured for me to come closer. "Actually, I could use your help holding this in place while I drill it in." I stepped forward, and as I held the wooden shelf steady, Tom moved behind me to position the drill. His proximity sent an unexpected shiver down my spine. His arm brushed against mine, and I felt my breath hitch, though I tried to hide it. "Almost there," he said, his voice low and close to my ear. When the task was done, I let out a nervous laugh and stepped back quickly. "Thanks, Melissa," he said, his tone casual, though there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something unspoken. "No problem," I replied, retreating to the kitchen, my heart pounding. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the memory of that moment. It wasn't anything overt, but it lingered in my mind, refusing to be dismissed. Over the next few days, I found myself more attuned to Tom's presence. I noticed the way his eyes followed me when he thought I wasn't looking, or how he'd find reasons to be near me, adjusting a picture frame while I cooked, standing too close when we passed in the hallway. I told myself it was harmless, he was just being friendly and I was reading too much into things. But deep down, I couldn't deny the pull I felt whenever he was around. It was exhilarating and terrifying all at once. One evening, as we sat together watching TV, Tom made a comment that left me speechless. "You deserve to be appreciated, Melissa," he said, his voice soft but firm. I turned to him, unsure how to respond. His gaze was steady, his expression earnest. "Thank you," I murmured, my cheeks flushing. It was a simple statement, yet it pierced through me, leaving me questioning everything, my marriage, my desires, and the dangerous path I seemed to be treading. The days passed, and the undercurrent of tension between Tom and me became harder to ignore. I wasn't entirely sure when it began to shift from simple companionship to something more charged, but once I noticed it, it was impossible to unsee. Aaron remained blissfully unaware, caught up in his work as usual. He'd leave early in the mornings, returning late at night, too exhausted to do much more than eat dinner in silence and fall asleep in front of the TV. I couldn't blame him entirely. His job was demanding. But I couldn't help but feel invisible. Tom, on the other hand, seemed to notice everything. "Melissa, you've been running around all day. Why don't you sit down for a minute?" he suggested one afternoon. I had been vacuuming the living room, trying to stay busy. "I'm fine," I replied, but he wasn't convinced. "Fine or stubborn?" he teased, taking the vacuum from my hands. "Come on, you deserve a break." He flashed that easy smile, the one that always seemed to disarm me. Before I could argue, he ushered me toward the couch and handed me a glass of iced tea. "You're spoiling me," I joked, trying to mask the flutter in my chest. "Maybe," he said with a wink, "but you deserve it." His words hit me harder than they should have. I couldn't remember the last time someone had told me I deserved anything. It wasn't Aaron's fault. He wasn't cruel or neglectful, just absent. But Tom had a way of filling those empty spaces, and I found myself looking forward to his company more than I should have. One evening, as we prepared dinner together, Tom stood behind me at the counter, reaching over my shoulder to grab a spice jar. His hand brushed mine, lingering just a moment longer than necessary. My breath caught, and I turned to face him. "Sorry," he said, but there was a glint in his eye, a small smile that hinted at something unspoken. "It's fine," I replied quickly, stepping aside to give him space. But the truth was, it wasn't fine. The electricity of his touch stayed with me long after the moment had passed. That night, as I lay in bed next to Aaron staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. There was nothing overtly wrong with what had happened, but it felt like a crack in the foundation. A small, almost imperceptible shift that I couldn't ignore. The following day, Tom and I went grocery shopping together. It had started as an offhand comment. He offered to join me since I had a long list and didn't want to deal with the crowds alone. "Let's make it an adventure," he said with a grin, grabbing the car keys before I could object. At the store, he pushed the cart while I ticked items off the list. It felt strangely intimate, walking the aisles together, picking out produce and debating which brand of coffee to buy. At one point, I reached for a box of cereal at the same time he did, and our hands collided. "Looks like we're in sync," he said, his voice light but his eyes heavy with something deeper. "Guess so," I replied, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. As we loaded the groceries into the trunk, Tom leaned closer than necessary, his arm brushing against mine. "Thanks for letting me tag along," he said softly. "I haven't had this much fun in ages." I forced a laugh, trying to deflect the weight of his words. "It's just grocery shopping, Tom." "Maybe," he said, his gaze lingering on me, "but it's nice to spend time with someone who actually wants to talk to me." I didn't know how to respond, so I busied myself with adjusting a bag in the trunk. His words stayed with me the entire drive home. Later that evening, as we unpacked the groceries, Aaron called to say he'd be working late again. Tom glanced at me as I hung up the phone, a knowing look in his eyes. "He works too hard," he said, his voice laced with concern. "He does," I admitted, trying to keep my tone neutral. Tom stepped closer, his expression softening. "You deserve more than that, Melissa." His words hit like a punch to the gut, not because they were cruel, but because they felt true. The tension between us reached a tipping point one rainy afternoon. Aaron was at work as usual, and Tom and I were sitting in the living room sipping coffee. The sound of raindrops against the window created a soothing backdrop, but the silence between us was thick with unspoken thoughts. "I've been meaning to tell you something," Tom said, suddenly breaking the silence. "What is it?" I asked, my heart pounding. He hesitated, his eyes searching mine. I think you're an incredible woman, Melissa. The way you take care of everything around here, the way you hold this family together. It doesn't go unnoticed." I didn't know what to say. The sincerity in his voice, the intensity of his gaze, it was overwhelming. "Thank you," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. He reached out, his hand brushing mine. "You deserve to be happy." For a moment, time seemed to stand still. I felt a rush of emotions, gratitude, confusion, longing, all colliding at once. I should check on the laundry," I stammered, pulling my hand away and standing up abruptly. As I fled to the laundry room, my mind raced. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't seem to stop. The boundaries between us were becoming blurrier by the day, and I was powerless to stop it. The boundaries between Tom and me continued to blur, each day bringing subtle moments that hinted at something unspoken but undeniable. I told myself it was harmless, just a connection born out of loneliness. But deep down, I knew I was tiptoeing toward a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It began with the small things. Tom would linger in the kitchen while I cooked, offering to chop vegetables or stir sauces, his presence warm and steady. His compliments became more frequent, his smiles more personal. I noticed how his gaze seemed to linger a second too long, how he always found an excuse to stand just a little closer than necessary. One afternoon, as I folded laundry in the living room, Tom walked in with a cup of coffee in each hand. "Thought you could use a break," he said, setting one down on the table next to me. "Thanks," I said, smiling up at him. "You didn't have to do that." He shrugged, sitting down on the couch across from me. "You do enough for everyone else. Someone should take care of you, too." There it was again, that subtle yet loaded comment that made my heart race. I sipped the coffee, avoiding his eyes, but I could feel his gaze on me. It was comforting and unnerving all at once. That night, Aaron came home late, as he often did. I had stayed up, waiting for him, but when he walked through the door, his only greeting was a quick peck on the cheek before he disappeared into his office to finish more work. I sat on the couch, feeling invisible, until I heard Tom's footsteps on the stairs. "You're still up?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, pulling the blanket tighter around me. Couldn't sleep. He sat down on the armrest, his presence comforting. "Rough night?" I sighed, glancing toward Aaron's closed office door. "Something like that."
Huh.
Tom didn't press for details, but he didn't need to. The look in his eyes told me he understood. For a moment, I wanted to lean into him, to let him wrap me in the warmth I'd been missing for so long. But instead, I pulled the blanket tighter and forced a smile. "I'll be fine," I said, more to myself than to him. "Of course you will," he replied, his hand brushing mine briefly before he stood. "But you don't have to do it all alone." His words stayed with me long after he went back upstairs. The next morning, the tension simmered just beneath the surface. Aaron had left early, as usual, and Tom and I were alone again. I busied myself with chores, hoping to distract myself from the weight of my thoughts. But every time I turned around, Tom was there, offering to help, making small talk, finding reasons to be near me. "Why don't you take a break?" he suggested as I loaded the dishwasher. "I'm fine," I replied, but he took the plate from my hand anyway, setting it down on the counter. "Come on, Melissa. You've been going non-stop. Sit down for a minute." Adam gave a playful shake of his head and smiled. His tone was firm but gentle, and I found myself obeying without protest. He poured 2 glasses of lemonade and joined me at the table, his eyes scanning my face as if searching for something. "You seem tired," he said finally. I laughed, though it sounded hollow even to me. "That obvious, huh?" "You don't have to pretend with me," he said, his voice low. "I see how hard you work, how much you give to everyone else. It's okay to take something for yourself once in a while." The air between us grew heavy, charged with a tension I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. I looked away, afraid of what he might see in my eyes. "Thanks, Tom," I said softly. "That means a lot." Later that week, I was in the backyard, hanging up laundry to dry. The sun was warm on my skin, the rhythmic motion of pinning clothes to the line oddly soothing. I didn't hear Tom come outside until he was standing behind me. "Need any help?" he asked, his voice startling me. I turned, my hand clutching a damp shirt. "You scared me," I said, laughing nervously. "Sorry," he said, his smile disarming. "Didn't mean to sneak up on you." He stepped closer, reaching for the shirt in my hand. His fingers brushed mine, and I froze, the sudden jolt of electricity between us catching me off guard. He noticed my hesitation, his eyes locking onto mine. "Melissa," he said softly, his tone a mixture of curiosity and something deeper. I pulled my hand away, forcing a laugh to break the moment. "I think I can manage hanging laundry on my own." "Uh-huh," he chuckled, stepping back. All right, but let me know if you change your mind." As he walked back toward the house, I felt a mix of relief and disappointment. The tension between us was becoming harder to deny, and I didn't trust myself to be alone with him for much longer. That evening, I found myself sitting on the porch swing, watching the sunset. Tom joined me, a glass of wine in his hand. He offered it to me with a smile. "You look like you could use this," he said. "Thanks," I replied, taking the glass and sipping it slowly. We sat in silence for a while, the quiet hum of the evening filling the space between us. It was peaceful, but the unspoken tension lingered, heavy and undeniable. "Do you ever think about what you really want?" Tom asked, suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. I glanced at him, startled by the question. "What do you mean?" He shrugged, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Sometimes we get so caught up in doing what's expected of us that we forget what makes us happy." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I thought about my marriage, the endless cycle of routine and loneliness, and I realized I didn't have an answer. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Tom turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "You deserve to be happy, Melissa. Don't forget that." His words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning. I looked away, afraid of what I might say if I met his gaze. The line between us was growing thinner by the day, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could resist crossing it. It was late one evening when everything started to unravel. The house was unusually quiet. Aaron had gone out of town for a client meeting, leaving Tom and me alone for the night. I told myself it was no different from the other evenings we'd spent together since he moved in. But deep down, I knew tonight felt different. After dinner, Tom suggested we watch a movie. I hesitated at first, sensing the unspoken tension that had been simmering between us for weeks. But I pushed the thought aside, convincing myself it was harmless. "Come on, Melissa," he said, his smile warm but his eyes carrying that same intensity I'd grown used to. "It'll be fun, just a movie." "Okay," I replied, my voice quieter than I intended. We settled on the couch, a respectable distance apart at first. The movie played, but I couldn't focus. I was hyper-aware of his presence, the subtle sound of his breathing, the way his arm rested casually on the back of the couch. Halfway through, I felt him shift closer, just enough that his knee brushed mine. The contact sent a jolt through me, but I didn't move away. As the movie reached its climax, I felt Tom's hand graze mine on the cushion between us. My pulse quickened, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Slowly, he laced his fingers with mine. It was a small gesture, but it felt monumental. It had to matter. "Melissa," he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sounds from the TV. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. His eyes searched mine, and I saw a vulnerability there that I hadn't expected. "I can't stop thinking about you," he confessed, his voice trembling slightly. "Tom, we can't," I started, but the words caught in my throat as he leaned in, his lips hovering inches from mine. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped him, but instead I closed the distance, letting the weight of weeks of tension and unspoken feelings crash over us. His lips were warm and insistent, his hand moving to the small of my back, pulling me closer. For a moment, I lost myself completely. The sound of a door creaking open shattered the moment. I pulled away abruptly, my heart racing as I turned to see Aaron standing in the doorway. His face was a mask of shock and confusion. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded, his voice sharp. I froze, my mind scrambling for an explanation, but there was no denying what he had just witnessed. Tom stood, his expression a mix of guilt and defiance. "Aaron, it's not what it looks like," I blurted out, the words feeling hollow even as I said them. "Really?" Aaron shot back, his eyes narrowing. "Because it looks like my wife and my father are—" "What, exactly? Care to explain?" I couldn't speak. The weight of my guilt pressed down on me, rendering me silent. "Aaron, calm down," Tom interjected, stepping forward. "Let's talk about this." "Talk about this?" Aaron's voice rose, his fists clenching at his sides. You've been living under my roof and this is how you repay me? It's not Melissa's fault, Tom said firmly. If you're going to blame anyone, blame me. I stared at him, stunned by his willingness to take the fall. But Aaron wasn't buying it. Oh, don't worry, I blame you both, he said, his voice dripping with venom. How long has this been going on? It just happened, I said weakly, tears welling in my eyes. I didn't mean for any of this. You didn't mean for it? Aaron cut me off, his tone bitter. That's supposed to make me feel better? My wife and my father? Jesus Christ, Melissa. The silence that followed was deafening. I could see the pain etched on Aaron's face, the betrayal cutting through him like a knife. Tom tried to speak, but Aaron held up a hand to stop him. Don't, he said, his voice cracking. Just don't. He turned and walked out, slamming the door behind him. I stood there, tears streaming down my face, as the weight of what had just happened settled over me. The hours that followed were a blur. Aaron didn't come back that night, and Tom and I avoided each other, the tension between us unbearable. I spent the night tossing and turning, my mind racing with guilt and regret. The next morning, Aaron returned, his face pale and his eyes bloodshot. He didn't say a word as he packed a bag and left again, slamming the door behind him. I tried to call him, to explain, but he didn't pick up. Tom stayed in the guest room, keeping his distance. But the damage had already been done. The fragile equilibrium we had maintained was shattered, and there was no going back. A week later, Aaron finally agreed to talk. He met me at a coffee shop, his expression cold and distant. I'm only here because I need answers, he said, his voice flat. I'm so sorry, Aaron, I began, my voice trembling. I never meant for any of this to happen. Then why did it? He demanded, his eyes burning with anger. You've been distant for months, Melissa. If you were unhappy, why didn't you just tell me? I didn't know how, I admitted, tears streaming down my face. I didn't want to hurt you. Well, congratulations, he said bitterly. Mission failed. The conversation was brutal, every word cutting deeper than the last. By the time it was over, I felt hollow, the weight of my choices suffocating me. Aaron left without saying goodbye, and I knew in my heart that things would never be the same. That evening, Tom approached me in the kitchen, his expression heavy with guilt. I'm sorry for everything, he said quietly. I never meant to hurt you or Aaron. I know, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, but we did, and now we have to live with it. Tom nodded, his shoulders slumping as he turned and walked away. As I stood there, alone in the silence, I realized that the line we had crossed could never be undone. The damage was done, and there was no way to repair the shattered pieces of our lives. The days that followed Aaron's discovery were a waking nightmare. He hadn't returned home since our confrontation, and the silence was suffocating. Every corner of the house seemed to echo with the weight of what had happened, a relentless reminder of the life I had shattered. Tom kept to himself, staying out of my way, but I knew he was just as burdened as I was. I tried to focus on routine tasks to keep from spiraling, laundry, dishes, sweeping the floors, but none of it felt real. My hands moved through the motions while my mind replayed Aaron's devastated expression, his biting words. I wanted to call him, to beg for forgiveness, but I didn't know where to begin. Then, one evening, the door opened, and Aaron walked in. He didn't carry his usual briefcase or laptop. Instead, he held a duffel bag, his face hard and unreadable. My heart leapt at the sight of him, but his cold demeanor quickly extinguished any hope I had of reconciliation. Aaron, I said softly, standing up from the couch where I'd been curled up with a blanket. I'm so glad you're home. Can we? He held up a hand, cutting me off. I'm only here to get the rest of my things. My chest tightened. Please, can we talk? I need to explain. Explain what? He snapped, his voice sharp. That you betrayed me with my own father? I don't think there's much left to explain, Melissa. Tears stung my eyes as I reached for him, but he stepped back, his gaze cold and distant. You didn't even try to talk to me when you were unhappy, he said, his voice trembling. You just went straight to him. It wasn't like that, I whispered, my voice breaking. I was lonely, Aaron. You were always working, and I felt invisible. And that makes it okay? He demanded, his tone rising. That gives you permission to destroy everything we've built? No, I admitted, my voice barely audible. It doesn't. I was wrong, and I hate myself for it. But please, Aaron, don't walk away without giving me a chance to make things right. He stared at me for a long moment, his expression a mixture of anger, hurt, and something else I couldn't place. Finally, he shook his head. I can't do this right now, he said, his voice flat. I need time. He turned and walked out the door, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence once again. That night, I found Tom sitting on the porch, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. He rarely smoked, but the stress of the past week had clearly pushed him to his limits. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure whether I should join him, but eventually I stepped outside. Mind if I sit? I asked, tentatively. He glanced at me, his eyes weary, and nodded. I sank onto the porch swing beside him, the cool night air brushing against my skin. I saw Aaron come by earlier, he said after a long silence. I nodded. He was just here to grab some things. Tom exhaled a cloud of smoke, staring out into the darkness. Do you think he'll ever forgive you? I don't know, I admitted, my voice trembling. I don't even know if I deserve his forgiveness. Tom looked at me then, his expression heavy with regret. I never meant for this to happen, Melissa. I let things get out of hand. It wasn't just you, I said quietly. I made choices too. Bad ones. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of our shared guilt pressing down on us. Finally, Tom crushed his cigarette under his shoe and stood. I think it's best if I leave, he said, his voice firm but sad. This house, this family, it needs time to heal, and I'm only making things worse by being here. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. Maybe you're right. Tom reached out, his hand brushing my cheek in a gesture that felt both tender and final. Take care of yourself, Melissa. You too, I whispered. And with that, he walked inside to pack his things, leaving me alone once again. The next day, Aaron called. His voice was tense and distant, but there was a glimmer of something, maybe hope, maybe obligation, that made my heart ache. We need to talk, he said. Okay, I replied, my voice trembling. When? Tonight. I'll come by around 7. The hours dragged by as I waited for him, my stomach churning with anxiety. When he finally arrived, he looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes and a heaviness in his posture that hadn't been there before. Melissa, he began, his tone measured. I've been doing a lot of thinking. Me too, I said quickly. Aaron, Please, he interrupted, holding up a hand. Let me finish. I nodded, clasping my hands tightly in my lap. I'm not going to pretend I'm okay with what happened, he said, his voice steady but pained. You broke my trust in a way I never thought possible, and it's going to take a long time, if ever, for me to forgive you. Tears spilled down my cheeks, but I stayed silent, letting him speak. But I also have to take some responsibility, he continued, surprising me. I wasn't there for you, Melissa. I let work consume me, and I took you for granted. That doesn't excuse what you did, but it does help me understand why it happened. Herod, I'm so sorry, I whispered, my voice cracking. I never wanted to hurt you. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't know if we can fix this, Melissa, but I'm willing to try, if you are. My heart swelled with a mixture of relief and guilt. Of course I want to try, I said quickly. I'll do whatever it takes, especially not feeling your gaze on my face. Then we'll start with counseling, he said firmly, and you'll need to cut ties with my dad, completely. An expression of surprise lightening his face. I understand, I said, my voice shaking. He's already planning to leave. Aaron nodded, his expression unreadable. Good. That's a start. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. Aaron and I started seeing a therapist, unpacking years of resentment and miscommunication. It was painful, messy, and at times felt impossible, but slowly we began to find our way back to each other. Tom left town shortly after our conversation on the porch. He called once to let us know he'd settled into a small apartment in the city, but we didn't speak again after that. His absence was both a relief and a reminder of the damage we'd caused. Aaron and I still had a long way to go, but for the first time in months there was a glimmer of hope. We were rebuilding something fragile, piece by piece, and I was determined not to let it slip through my fingers again. One evening, as Aaron and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, he reached over and took my hand. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes. We've got a lot to work through, he said quietly, but I think we can get there. I nodded, squeezing his hand tightly. I think so too. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time I felt a flicker of hope. It wouldn't be easy, but I was ready to fight for what we had, and to prove to Aaron that I was worth fighting for too. Even with Tom gone and Aaron back in the house, the tension between us was palpable. We had agreed to give counseling a try, but the wounds were still fresh, and every conversation felt like walking on eggshells. The smallest misstep could ignite the simmering anger that lay just beneath the surface. Our therapist, Dr. Klein, was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She didn't sugarcoat things, which I appreciated, but her bluntness often caught me off guard. In order to heal, you both need to be honest about what you want from this marriage, she said during one of our sessions. Aaron, you need to express your anger without shutting Melissa out. And Melissa, you need to confront the reasons why you sought emotional connection outside of your marriage. Aaron scoffed, leaning back in his chair. That's easy. She wanted someone to stroke her ego while I was out working my ass off to support us. That's not fair, I interjected, my voice shaking. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. I was lonely, Aaron. I felt like I didn't exist to you anymore. He glared at me, his jaw tight. So instead of talking to me, you decided to talk to my father, and not just talk, apparently? Dr. Klein held up a hand to stop the argument from escalating. This isn't about assigning blame. It's about understanding what led you here, and figuring out if you can move forward. Aaron shook his head, staring at the floor. I just don't know if I can forgive this, he said quietly. Every time I look at you, all I see is him. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. I blinked back tears, struggling to hold myself together. I know I hurt you, I said softly, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I love you, Aaron. I want to make this work. Dr. Klein leaned forward, her gaze steady. Aaron, do you still love Melissa? He hesitated, his hands clenching into fists. I don't know, he admitted. I want to, but it's hard. At home, the tension only grew worse. Every interaction felt strained, every word carefully measured to avoid triggering an argument. Aaron spent most of his time in his office, burying himself in work, while I tried to keep the house running as usual. But nothing felt normal anymore. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, Aaron appeared in the doorway. His expression was hard, his eyes full of a mix of anger and sadness. "We need to set some boundaries," he said abruptly. "Okay," I replied cautiously, setting down the dish I was washing. "What kind of boundaries?" "For starters, no more contact with my dad," he said firmly. "Not a phone call, not an email, nothing." "I already told you I'm not speaking to him," I said, my voice defensive. "He's out of our lives, Aaron." "Good," he said, crossing his arms. "Because if I even suspect that you're talking to him, I'm done. Do you understand me, Melissa? Done." The ultimatum stung, but I nodded, knowing I had no room to argue. "I understand." He nodded curtly and walked away, leaving me alone with the weight of his words. Despite Aaron's demands, Tom lingered in the shadows of my mind. I hated myself for it, but there were moments when I missed him. His warmth, his attentiveness, the way he made me feel seen. It wasn't love, I told myself. It was just a reaction to the emptiness I'd felt for so long. But the guilt of those thoughts gnawed at me, making it even harder to repair what was left of my marriage. Aaron, too, was struggling. I could see it in the way he avoided looking at me for too long, the way he flinched when I touched him. He wanted to forgive me, I knew that much, but he didn't know how. One night, as we lay in bed in tense silence, he spoke. "Get him?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I turned to face him, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his tone. "I don't know," I admitted. "It wasn't about him, Aaron. It was about me feeling invisible." He let out a bitter laugh. "Invisible? You're all I ever thought about, Melissa. Everything I've done, every long hour, every late night. It was all for you." "I know," I said, tears streaming down my face. "But I didn't need your money or your success. I just needed you." His silence was deafening, and I knew my words had hit a nerve. But instead of responding, he turned away, leaving me to cry quietly into the darkness. The breaking point came during another session with Dr. Klein. She had asked us to write letters to each other, explaining our feelings without interruption. I had poured my heart into mine, hoping it would help Aaron see how deeply I regretted my actions. When it was his turn to read, his voice trembled with anger and hurt. "Melissa," he began, "I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. You weren't just my wife. You were my safe place, my home. And now, every time I think about you, all I feel is betrayal. I want to forgive you, but I don't know how to get past this. How do I stop seeing him when I look at you?" His words broke something inside me. For weeks, I had been holding on to the hope that we could rebuild, but hearing the depth of his pain made me realize how uncertain our future really was. "I don't have all the answers," I said softly when he finished, "but I'm willing to fight for us, Aaron. I just need to know if you are too." Dr. Klein looked at him expectantly, but Aaron remained silent, his gaze fixed on the floor. That evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, the silence was suffocating. I finally spoke, my voice shaking with desperation. "Aaron, please," I said, "tell me what you're thinking." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with anguish. "I'm thinking that I don't know how to move on from this." I reached for his hand, but he pulled away, the rejection cutting deeper than any words could. "I need time," he said, his voice hollow. "I can't do this right now." And with that, he stood and walked away, leaving me alone once again. The days following Heron's declaration were excruciating. He was physically present in the house, but emotionally absent, a ghost of the man I had married. Every interaction felt like a test, every word a potential landmine. The tension had become unbearable, and I knew it was only a matter of time before everything came to a head. It happened on a quiet Sunday morning. The house was eerily still, with Heron locked in his office and me sipping coffee at the kitchen table. The silence was interrupted by the sound of the doorbell. I froze, my stomach knotting with a sense of foreboding. When I opened the door, Tom stood there, his expression a mix of regret and determination. "Melissa," he began, his voice low, "I need to talk to you." I glanced over my shoulder, my heart pounding. "You shouldn't be here, Tom." "Please," he said, his eyes pleading. "I just need a few minutes." Before I could respond, Aaron's voice rang out behind me. "What the hell are you doing here?" I turned to see him standing in the doorway of the kitchen, his face a mask of fury. His fists were clenched, his posture rigid, and his eyes burned with betrayal. "I came to apologize," Tom said, stepping inside despite my protests. "I know I've caused a lot of pain, and I need to make things right." "Make things right?" Aaron spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You think you can just waltz in here and fix this with an apology?" "Heron, please," I said, stepping between them. "Let's just hear him out." "No," Aaron snapped, his gaze locked on Tom. "You don't get to mediate this, Melissa. This is between me and him." Tom raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I need you to know how sorry I am. What happened between Melissa and me? It was a mistake." "A mistake?" Aaron repeated, his voice rising. "You call betraying your own son a mistake?" "Yes," Tom said firmly. "It was wrong, and I regret it every day." Aaron let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You regret it? That's supposed to make me feel better? You destroyed my marriage, my trust, everything. And now you want absolution?" "I'm not asking for absolution," Tom said, his voice steady. "I'm asking for the chance to help you move forward." "Move forward?" Aaron took a step closer, his fists tightening. "How exactly am I supposed to do that when every time I look at my wife, I see you?" The weight of Aaron's words hung in the air, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. As I let go, Tom took a deep breath, his expression pained. "Aaron, I know I've lost your trust, and I'll never forgive myself for what I've done. But Melissa loves you. She's willing to do whatever it takes to fix this." Aaron turned to me then, his eyes filled with anger and despair. "Do you love me, Melissa?" "Yes," I said, my voice trembling. "I love you more than anything." "Then why?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "Why did you do this to me?" Tears streamed down my face as I struggled to find the words. "I was lonely, Aaron. I felt like I didn't matter to you anymore. And Tom, he made me feel seen." Aaron's jaw tightened, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "So instead of talking to me, you turned to him, my father?" "I know I messed up," I said, my voice cracking, "but I never stopped loving you." Aaron shook his head, his expression a mix of anger and heartbreak. "You have a funny way of showing it." Tom stepped forward then, his voice steady but imploring. "Aaron, don't let my mistakes destroy your marriage. Melissa loves you, and she's willing to fight for you." Aaron turned to him, his eyes blazing. "You don't get to tell me how to fix my marriage. You lost that right the moment you touched her." The room fell silent, the weight of Aaron's words crushing the air out of my lungs. Tom's shoulders sagged, and for the first time he looked defeated. "You're right," he said softly. "I don't have the right. But I hope, for your sake, you can find a way to move forward." Aaron didn't respond. He simply stood there, his chest heaving as he fought to control his emotions. Finally, he turned to me. "I need time, Melissa," he said, his voice cold. "Time to figure out if I can even look at you without feeling sick." His words cut deep, but I nodded, knowing I had no right to protest. "Take all the time you need." Without another word, Aaron turned and walked out the door. I heard the sound of his car engine starting, and then he was gone. Tom stood in the middle of the living room, his presence a painful reminder of everything I had lost. "I'm sorry, Melissa," he said quietly, "for everything." I nodded, unable to speak. He hesitated for a moment, then turned and left, closing the door softly behind him. That night, the house felt emptier than ever. I sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, my mind racing with guilt, regret, and uncertainty. I had no idea if Aaron would come back, or if our marriage was beyond saving. All I knew was that I had to keep fighting, no matter how long it took. The confrontation had left me raw and broken, but it had also laid everything bare. There were no more secrets. No more excuses. It was time to face the consequences of my actions and figure out if there was still a future worth salvaging. The days following Aaron's departure were some of the loneliest of my life. He hadn't called, texted, or shown any sign that he intended to come back. Each passing hour felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of my mistakes was pressing me into the ground. I spent most of my time in silence, staring at the empty spaces where he used to be. Our therapist, Dr. Klein, reached out after Aaron missed our scheduled session. She wanted to know if I had heard from him. When I told her I hadn't, she encouraged me to keep showing up for therapy, even if he wasn't ready to return. Reluctantly, I agreed. I need to work on myself," I admitted during my solo sessions. "I can't expect Aaron to forgive me if I don't even understand why I let things spiral out of control." Dr. Klein nodded, her expression kind but firm. "You're taking the first step by being here, Melissa. But understanding your actions is only part of the journey. You need to be prepared for the possibility that Aaron may not come back." Her words stung, but I knew she was right. I had to face the reality that my marriage might be over, no matter how much I wanted to fix it. 2 weeks after the confrontation, Aaron called. His voice was tense and distant, but it was the first time I'd heard from him since he left. "I think we need to meet," he said, skipping any pleasantries. "Okay," I replied quickly. "When?" "Tomorrow," he said, "at Dr. Klein's office. I think it's the only place we can have a productive conversation." I agreed, my heart racing with a mix of hope and dread. I spent the rest of the night replaying every moment of our relationship in my mind, trying to figure out what I could say to convince him that we were worth saving. The next day, I arrived at Dr. Klein's office early. My hands were trembling as I sat in the waiting room, staring at the door and willing Aaron to walk through it. When he finally did, my breath caught in my throat. He looked tired, his face pale and drawn. But he was here. Dr. Klein ushered us into her office, her calm presence a small comfort in the storm of emotions swirling between us. "I'm glad you both agreed to meet," she began. "This is a safe space to express your feelings and work through the challenges you're facing. Aaron, why don't you start by sharing what brought you here today?" Aaron took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the floor. "I came because I need closure," he said finally. Whether that means moving forward together or going our separate ways, I can't keep living in this limbo. His words felt like a knife to my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. I understand, I said softly, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn back your trust. He looked up at me then, his eyes filled with pain. I don't even know if that's possible, Melissa. Every time I think about what happened, it feels like I'm reliving the betrayal all over again. I know I hurt you, I said, my voice trembling, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I love you, Aaron. I never stopped loving you. Dr. Klein interjected gently. Aaron, what do you need from Melissa in order to move forward? What would it take to begin rebuilding trust? He hesitated, his jaw tightening. I need transparency, he said finally. No secrets, no half-truths. I need to know that I'm not going to be blindsided again. I can do that, I said quickly. I'll tell you everything, no matter how hard it is. And I need time, he continued, his voice heavy. Time to figure out if I can forgive you or if this is just too much to overcome. I nodded, tears streaming down my face. Take all the time you need. I'll wait for as long as it takes. Over the next few weeks, Aaron and I began the slow, painful process of rebuilding. It wasn't easy. There were moments when his anger boiled over, when he would lash out with words that cut deep. But there were also moments of tenderness, small, fleeting glimmers of the connection we once shared. One evening, as we sat on the porch together, he broke the silence with a question I hadn't expected. Do you think we can ever get back to what we were? He asked, his voice quiet. I looked at him, my heart aching. I don't know, I admitted. But I think we can build something new, something stronger. He nodded slowly, as if considering my words. I want to believe that, he said. I really do. Dr. Klein continued to guide us through the healing process. She encouraged us to focus on rebuilding our emotional connection, to find ways to reconnect as partners rather than just cohabitants. We started doing small things together, cooking meals, taking walks, even watching movies in the evenings. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One night, as we sat on the couch, Aaron reached for my hand. His touch was hesitant, almost uncertain, but it sent a wave of hope surging through me. I'm trying, Melissa, he said, his voice filled with vulnerability. I don't know if I'll ever completely get over what happened, but I'm trying. That's all I can ask for, I said, squeezing his hand gently. And I'll keep trying too. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in months, it felt like we were moving in the right direction. Aaron and I were both scarred by what had happened, but we were also learning to lean on each other again, to find strength in our shared desire to heal. I knew it would take time, months, maybe years, but I was willing to fight for our marriage, no matter how hard it got, because despite everything, I still believed in us, and I hoped that one day Aaron would too. It was a year to the day since that awful moment when Aaron walked in and saw the betrayal etched into the fabric of our marriage, a year of pain, healing, and uncertainty. And now, as I stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, I realized how much had changed and how much still remained fragile. Aaron walked in just as I was setting the table, carrying a bouquet of flowers. It was a simple gesture, but one that took my breath away. It reminded me of the early days of our relationship, when love was new and uncomplicated. These are for you, he said, handing them to me with a small smile. You always liked daisies. I took the flowers, tears welling in my eyes. Thank you, I whispered, my voice trembling. They're beautiful. He nodded, watching me place them in a vase. There was a tenderness in his gaze that I hadn't seen in months, and it filled me with a cautious hope. We ate dinner together, the conversation light and easy. It was a stark contrast to the tense silences that had once dominated our evenings. We talked about work, about plans for the weekend, and even shared a few laughs. It felt normal, and for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to believe that normal might actually be within reach. After dinner, Aaron suggested we take a walk. The air was cool and crisp, the autumn leaves crunching under our feet as we strolled through the neighborhood. He reached for my hand, and I let him take it, the warmth of his touch grounding me in the moment. "Melissa," he began, after a long silence, his voice steady but soft. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about everything that's happened." I held my breath, unsure of where this was going. "I won't lie and say I've forgotten what you did," he continued. "There are still days when the memories come back and it feels like a fresh wound. But I've realized something over this past year." "What's that?" I asked, my heart pounding. He stopped walking and turned to face me, his eyes searching mine. "I still love you," he said simply. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forget, but I know that I don't want to lose you. I'm tired of letting the past define us. I want to try, for real this time." Tears spilled down my cheeks as I nodded, too overcome with emotion to speak. He pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to believe that we could have a future together. The days that followed felt like a fresh start. Aaron and I began rebuilding not just our marriage, but also our friendship. We spent more time together, rediscovering the things we loved about each other. It wasn't always easy. There were still moments of tension, still shadows of the past that crept in when we least expected them. But we faced those moments together, determined not to let them derail us. Tom remained a ghost in our lives, a shadow that neither of us dared to acknowledge aloud. He had moved out of state shortly after the confrontation and hadn't reached out since. I knew Aaron was relieved by his absence, and I didn't blame him. It was easier to heal without the constant reminder of what had happened. Still, there were times when the guilt threatened to consume me. I carried the weight of my choices every day, a reminder of how close I had come to losing everything. But instead of letting it define me, I used it as a motivator. To be better, to love harder, to fight for what mattered most. On our anniversary, Aaron surprised me with a weekend getaway. He didn't tell me where we were going, just that I should pack a bag and be ready by morning. When we arrived at the cabin nestled deep in the woods, I couldn't help but laugh. "You remembered," I said, smiling at him. "Of course I did," he replied, his eyes warm. This was where we spent our first anniversary. I thought it was time to make some new memories. The weekend was perfect. We hiked during the day, cooked meals together in the tiny kitchen, and spent the evenings curled up by the fire, talking about everything and nothing. It felt like a reset, a chance to leave the weight of the past behind and focus on the life we were building together. On our last night there, Aaron took my hand and led me outside. The sky was clear, the stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet darkness. He turned to me, his expression serious but soft. "I want to make a promise to you," he said, "that I'll keep trying, that I'll keep fighting for us. I know it won't always be easy, but I'm in this for the long haul. Are you?" I nodded, tears streaming down my face. "I promise," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "I'll never stop fighting for us." He kissed me then, his lips soft and familiar, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt whole. The road ahead wasn't perfect, no marriage ever is. There were still scars, still moments when the past threatened to resurface, but Aaron and I had learned how to face those moments together, as partners, as a team. We weren't the same people we had been before the betrayal, and our marriage wasn't the same either. But in a way, that made it stronger. We had survived the storm, and we had come out on the other side, battered but still standing. As I stood in the kitchen one morning, watching Aaron sip his coffee and read the newspaper, I felt a wave of gratitude wash over me. Gratitude for the second chance we had been given, for the love that had endured despite everything, and for the man who had chosen to stay and fight for us. Aaron looked up then, catching my gaze. He smiled, and in that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. We weren't perfect, but we were enough. And for us, that was everything. The journey through this story is one of emotional complexity, betrayal, and ultimately, resilience. The choices made by Melissa and the circumstances that followed serve as a poignant reminder of the fragility of relationships and the profound consequences of our actions. Melissa's affair with her father-in-law, Tom, wasn't born from malice, but from a deep sense of loneliness and invisibility in her marriage. It underscores how unspoken emotions and unmet needs can create fissures in even the most committed relationships. Yet, her actions weren't without consequence. The fallout was catastrophic, ripping apart not only her marriage but also the family dynamic that had once seemed stable. Aaron's discovery of the affair was a moment of raw heartbreak. His journey from anger and betrayal to cautious forgiveness showcases the profound difficulty of rebuilding trust. His character reveals the emotional strength required to confront such a deep wound, and the fragility of hope when faced with overwhelming pain. Tom, too, played a pivotal role, not just as a participant in the betrayal, but as a man seeking redemption. His exit from their lives was as much a consequence of his guilt as it was an acknowledgement of the damage he caused. It was a necessary step, allowing Aaron and Melissa the space they needed to heal. The resolution is bittersweet, reflecting the imperfections of real-life relationships. Melissa and Aaron's willingness to fight for their marriage despite the scars highlights the transformative power of love and the strength found in vulnerability. Their decision to rebuild rather than walk away speaks to the resilience of the human spirit and the possibility of finding a new path after even the most profound betrayal. This story doesn't tie everything up in a neat bow, but that's what makes it resonate. It's a narrative of mistakes and consequences, love and loss, but most importantly, of hope. It leaves us pondering the nature of forgiveness, the weight of our choices, and the lengths we're willing to go to save the relationships that define us. End of The Field Mother of the Poet.